we have a guest, I'm going to say out of the ordinary tonight, because we typically do a lot of tech stuff, but we're going to kind of dip our toes into the political arena just a bit. And I know people are going to land on here and say, why are you guys talking about politics? And I'm going to put it right up front. A lot of you who are on here regularly already know that everything that we do is affected, obviously, by the laws and the decisions that Congress and everyone else makes. And there I am, frozen on the screen again. So you know what? Let's do this. We're just going to jump right into it. And if this doesn't run smoothly, I don't know what else to do except for apologizing for wasting your time. I hope that's not the case. But Shahid, I'm going to go ahead and add you on now, everyone. I would like you to welcome. This is Shahid Buttar. He's running for Congress in the 12th District of California against your favorite, Nancy Pelosi. How are you doing, Shahid?
Doing well. Shahid for your reference, but it's great to be with you, Mike. Thanks for having me on.
You messed up your name, Shahid.
Just like that. It's all good. If I had a nickel for every time somebody got my name wrong, I would be as wealthy as Nancy Pelosi.
I got to tell you, that's a good one, actually. I got to tell you, I'm confident I've heard your name pronounced wrong many times, and that's where I got it from. So I should have checked with you up front there.
It doesn't surprise me, and it's all good. No worries, honestly.
Excellent. Well, I certainly hope that your camera is working a lot smoother than mine. I was telling everybody here, this is just an ongoing thing to the point where I feel like it is a conspiracy. I test my equipment. It works all day long up till the day of the broadcast. And then I'm convinced Ajit Pai is somewhere behind the scenes saying, oh, you want to talk about net neutrality? And then he hits some little button and everything goes terrible. But in any case,
you sound like every technologist I've ever met.
What's that?
I said, you sound like every technologist I've ever met.
Oh, man, it has been it's just I don't know what to do. Move next to a provider and plug directly into their connection. In any case, let's continue. And I certainly hope not to waste time.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, please. I don't want to interrupt you.
It's all right. It's internet lag, please.
I was just suggesting it sounds like you were experiencing the lamentable state of our internet infrastructure.
I believe so. The one that we all, my understanding is, on average, any citizen who's been working and earning a living for about the last 20 years has contributed about $5,000 into. Does that sound right to you?
Has contributed $5,000 into what?
Into building the infrastructure of the internet.
Oh, I see. It wouldn't surprise me. I'd need to. It's the first time I've heard that statistic. I need to learn more to grip it.
Okay, no worries. We dig into this stuff quite often, and there have been lots of grants and a lot of taxpayer money, basically, that go to these cable providers, these internet providers, where they say, we need the money. It's the only way that we can continue. We have to provide everyone with broadband service. And at the end of the day, I'm still paying over $100 a month, and this is what I get. And none of that money's been paid back. So wherever it ends up going, it doesn't look like all of it's going into the system. And that's one of the things that we, when I was doing the live streams in the past, that we would talk about quite often, because net neutrality initially has, from the beginning, it was presented, in my opinion, wrong in many cases. They pretty much flipped it around and said, if we don't have net neutrality, you guys are going to suffer. And our experience has been more like, no, if we have net neutrality, that doesn't seem like it's a good thing for, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of access to information, and so on.
I'm curious how you get there. Unpack that for me. It's
okay. Quite a stretch. Okay, so by taking away net neutrality, which gives equal access to the speed and the access of the internet, if you could selectively go in and say, hey, you know what? We have a progressive candidate who wants to show something on whatever platform it is, and we can decide, because there is no net neutrality, and you remember, it used to be across the board, everyone was equal. So no matter what it is that you wanted to have access to, they would have the ability to provide that information or that speed at a consistent rate. And that was one of the guarantees that we got from net neutrality. Now, without it, what happens is people can pick and choose. For example, a few years ago, T-Mobile decided that you could have streaming videos through the T-Mobile service that was provided on their network. However, you would not necessarily get that full throttle from any competitor, let's say Netflix, for example. Right. So if I say, you know what, you can have access to Netflix, but it's miserable to watch. And it could be any type of programming, really. You can have access to this, but if you come to our channel of what we're broadcasting, of what our advertisers want you to see, we're going to let you see it in 4K, unlimited streaming, super lightning fast, immediate access.
Totally, yeah.
That obviously is not a blatant way of suppressing freedom of speech, but when it comes down to it, people are going to spend a lot more time doing things that are accessible, right? They're going to want to be, what's the saying? You know, if you want to take away someone's any type of freedom, all you really have to do is make it convenient, right? So if you say, hey, we have lots of big companies behind us that want to keep you on, I don't want to, I hate to name names, and I'm already doing that, but here's what we want you to watch. Therefore, it's cheap, it's fast, and it's high quality. Here's the stuff that we don't really want you to watch because our advertisers don't back that, or, you know, the people who make the decisions as to what information we think you should have access to are able to turn that throttle down. So it's delivered at a lower quality and at a lower speed. So even though it's not being taken away completely, it's being made so inconvenient that people are likely to gravitate towards a certain medium, which, as you, I'm sure, well know, that when we look at things like mainstream media, if you can turn on the channel and click a button and instantly get access to whatever it is, you're more likely to tune into that. And I know that, you know, a lot of us are going away from that now, but a lot of people who are a little less tech savvy feel like if they turn on the evening news, that's what's happening right now. Those are the people they need to listen to. And, you know, again, the amount of influence that the media has over the public's decision, I don't think is disputed by many people at all. You know, on any side of any fence, there's a clear indication that the media kind of controls the narrative around it. Any type of issue, any person who's out there, any candidates that they like or they don't like, or they want to you know, kind of keep out of the picture. So that's one of the reasons that topic is kind of a hot button issue for me. You know, that's something that it's gone, but hopefully in the future we bring that back somehow. But enough about that. I feel like I'm doing all the talking, and I really appreciate you you know, having your time here. So do you generally have something you open with that just kind of introduces, you know, what you're all about and what you're up against? Because I've been kind of following, I mean, I've been on your website, and I got to say, every time I look at what you have listed for your, as far as the things that you stand behind, I feel more and more like that's not something that we don't all on some level agree with, but I feel like we're still being divided so that people say, well, if you do it that way, it's wrong. Therefore, we have to do something completely different. I don't think anybody wants to see homeless people starving, you know, 7 to 9 different wars going on at the same time, for-profit prisons, and, you know, we can keep on the list. I think the biggest difference is in the way that people think that we should handle those things.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. And you're absolutely right. Thank you for having me on, by the way. You're absolutely right to draw attention to the issues that bring us together and the divisions that emerge around potential solutions. In terms of like stepping into it, I maybe just would use the jumping off point from before when you were talking about the ways in which we've all subsidized the creation of internet infrastructure that's monetized by corporations. Ultimately, what I'm here to do is fight on behalf of the public against corporations and government agencies. I see the world through the lens of power versus the people who don't have it. And I've spent my life standing on behalf of people who don't have it, confronting power in different forms, usually in the hands of government agencies. That's where I've been most focused, though early in my career, I did work very early in the movement for marriage equality. I did work at the national level in the movement to try to get corporate money out of elections. And then I've particularly gone deep over the last 10 years in the movement to challenge surveillance and defend both privacy and the right to dissent. A lot of people across the country have grown increasingly concerned about the emergence of potential fascism under an administration that knows no respect for the rule of law. The emergence of fascism in the United States is not, in fact, in any way a new phenomenon. And while a lot of people have come to be aware of it, particularly in the last year or perhaps the last 4. I've recognized it since the Bush versus Gore decision. And I spent a lot of time in Washington during the Obama administration fighting it from the left, particularly on civil liberties issues, as even our Democratic presidents have leaned into mass surveillance, executive secrecy, impunity for human rights abuses, wanton state violence, leaving Americans, innocent, unarmed Americans, dead at the rate of 1 every day and a half. And this is a bipartisan phenomenon. And the reason I'm running for Congress is simply because we have not seen meaningful alternatives from corporate Democrats. And thankfully, I first ran for this seat in 2018 on a platform not unlike many colleagues who've gone on to serve in Congress, and I'm eager to join and expand the squad. And that vision to put human beings in our communities at the center of our public policy decisions instead of corporate profits. That's in a very succinct way of trying to get across what I'm here for and the paradigm change, the alternative that our generational shift presents the voters of San Francisco and we the people of the United States.
Okay, you just said about 12 things that I wanted to keep stopping and say, let's go into that. So I know that your time is limited, so I'm going to try not to keep you on all night. But for anyone who's wondering what he was referring to there, during the Bush-Gore election, what happened was they pretty much used, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they used the power of the court to decide the outcome of the election rather than letting it play out. So when we had this idealistic idea of the separation of powers a long time ago. And I believe that no matter which side you stand on, and at this point, I kind of feel this like the side is more the people versus the people in control of everything rather than—
You nailed it. You nailed it. It's not parties. There's a really crucial thing you're pressing on here. Yes, please go on.
It's really, and I bring this up all the time, the way that I see this is more of a divide and conquer tactic. So
yes,
if we can keep the right fighting the left and everyone demonizing each other on the fringes, and for the most part, the outrageous things that we see that fuel this rage addiction that people seem to have these days is showing people that act far beyond whatever it is that their political leanings really support. We see somebody doing something outrageous and suddenly all those people are crazy. Everybody on the right is this and everybody on the left is that. And
right.
Meanwhile, you just sit back and you go, well, there's someone just kind of kicking back and watching the show and really enjoying the fact that the attention's not on them. And it's sad. I mean, it's really heartbreaking. Again, I'm a little older and I grew up here in California, and to see how much everything has changed, where it felt like, at least when I was younger, that we were a united country. We were the best country in the world. We all stood together. And then, you dig into history and you see that it hasn't been a perfect ride all the way along. They kind of omit things here and there.
Far from it.
But what I was getting at was that they separated. They always taught us you had the executive, the judicial, and the legislative branches of government, and they were separated for a reason. That way they could kind of balance each other.
Local. Like that's just to complicate that. Then there's federal, state, local. So it's not just three branches. It's 3 branches across 3 layers. So you've got like a 9-box matrix that is the government, right? And it's as you're putting it, divided for a reason, and that reason is really important at a time like this.
Yeah, and they called it checks and balances. But as we start to consolidate power, if we have one person in charge of everything, fascism, right, for the most part, that goes away. And the ability to convince the public that that's in their best interest is the thing that makes my mind want to explode. It's like you're being told what to think and what to do and to fight each other. And a lot of people are gung ho on it, on both sides. It's pretty. I mean, this is the craziest time in my life for sure. I've never seen anything
on that
like
part
this.
About like how we're taught what to think and the limits of the debate, because there's an important point that you raised there. So the person I'm challenging, I'm running for Congress against Nancy Pelosi. She's the Speaker of the House. Let's talk about her. She's the head of the Democratic Party, and very much to your point, she's constructed by corporate media sources as if she's a lion of the left fighting our criminal president, but none of that's actually true. And the record is transparently public. It's all there, but you won't hear it from MSNBC. You won't even hear it from Fox, because the theater that all of the corporate media are vested in is one of partisan division. At the end of the day, both of the major corporate political parties have been fleecing the American public for decades. And this has been particularly true since the 90s, when the Democratic Party slid to the right to compete with the Republican Party for corporate cash. And ever since then, there has not been a Labor Party in the United States. The reason I'm running for Congress is to remove the corporate Speaker of the House and send a signal very loudly across the Democratic Party that any urban Democrat is either going to show up for our communities and embrace universal health care, embrace climate justice, embrace the calls to find better alternatives to secure public safety than paramilitary predatory policing. And if they don't show up for our communities, we, the people of the United States, are going to show them, the career politicians, the door. And the reason that signal will be so loud when we replace Pelosi as the voice of San Francisco in the House is that she is the leading corporate fundraiser among the entire Democratic caucus. So if we, Ocasio-Cortez made a big wave, rightfully so, in 2018 when she removed Pelosi's deputy. When we remove the Queen herself, it will show that Democrats can't defend even the strongest, most well-funded among them. And the reason we're very confident we can win this seat is because San Francisco is a progressive city. We're proud about our values. Bernie and Warren voters together were over 50% in the presidential primary here this spring. We know the votes are there. And the question is enough of San Francisco aware of the record of the incumbent? Or will people be led, spoon-fed, confused by corporate propaganda into voting against their interests? Now, Nancy Pelosi hasn't debated anyone since Ronald Reagan was the president. It was 1987 was the last time she showed up for a debate. I am the first Democrat ever in her 30-year career to reach the November election. It's not disrespectful to me for her not to show up for a debate. It does suggest some degree of entitlement with respect to the voters and the district and democracy. And I would just wonder how a career incumbent can get away for an entire generation without defending their record in public when their record in public includes funding Trump's concentration camps, funding the DHS goon squads that have been used to suppress dissent paramilitarily in Kenosha and Portland, supporting his corporate trade agreements, which undermined human rights and labor and environmental standards around the world, paving his path in policy from one issue to the next while mouthing resistance theatrically. That's the actual record of Nancy Pelosi during her time as the Speaker of the House. And ultimately, our race is a test of how sophisticated is the electorate, how much attention do people pay, and ultimately, how strong is the media in this country to hold career incumbents accountable to their records.
Yeah, what you said, I have to, and I'm certainly not the first person, but quite some time ago, it seemed like maybe Nancy Pelosi and Trump are just working together behind the scenes. That's really the feeling that you get. It's not like there's, she's tearing up papers on TV screens and slow clapping and stuff. But beyond that, and I will say, I know that I have viewers who are on both sides. We definitely have some people that voted for Trump, and we have people that, may or may not vote for Biden. I don't know how that's going to go. But I think that what you're saying. What's that?
They could all agree with what you just said, because the idea of them working together, that frankly, that's not a partisan question. I mean, you're observing their class interests and the fact that they absolutely work in concert on policy. That's uncontrovertible. It's absolutely true.
And what you're saying is, again, it just seems like it goes back, and I'm a political novice by all means. So this is, bear with me. The situation that brought us Trump, because, we always demonize whoever's in control, right? Anytime things are bad, it's that person's bad. And I don't think that Trump's moral character is really in question. We kind of know what he's about. He's a businessman. He's out to make money. But it seems to me more like the underlying issue is what brought Trump to power. And that was the frustration of working people. And he came in and said the right words. And, we've always got this dividing line when it comes down to it. Let's be honest. The Republicans that go, or the conservatives, I say, that vote Republican are going to heavily depend on one or two issues. You know, it's going to be abortion and guns, and all the others, and the same with the people, you know, Democrats that vote. It's going to be those two or maybe three or four more issues, but all the other stuff that they ever talk about, it's just talk for the most part. We're going to change this, we're going to do that, we're going to lower taxes, then we'll raise taxes. But what it really comes down to is someone motivating people to go out and vote on a small number of issues. And that's why it seems to me like, you know, we just see this voting down party lines because, well, we got to keep those other guys out because they don't agree with us on these, you know, on these two or three things or whatever it is. But give me 1 second here because I've got, I know there was one question I wanted to make sure not to skip over. Okay, yeah, Nate, we'll get to that in just a second. And I don't want to lose focus too much. You know, there were some tech stuff, topics that I wanted to run by you. And man, I tell you, I'd like to sit down with you one of these days. Maybe we'll hang out and just hash it out. Because I've got a million questions, but I know your time is valuable. You're in a race, man. And I really want you to win. I got to tell you, I was aware of you way before Anthony ever said anything to me. I've been following everybody, and I know that you've done the rounds on YouTube on all the shows that I watch, so that's awesome. And when I saw your website,
do you know the story how we met? My story with Anthony?
I believe he said you guys were out somewhere and you were doing like a spontaneous poetry thing.
18 years ago. Yeah, 18 years ago in Palo Alto, we ran into each other literally on the street. I was performing like on a sidewalk and we connected and we've been friends ever since. And then we collaborated on a nonprofit fundraiser series, an event series. We were throwing parties in San Francisco to raise money for immigrant groups. And he was one of the organizers of that event series that I DJ'd. And I got deep love for your brother. I'm glad he brought us together. I just wanted to share that because I thought the story is very
that's awesome. And on top of it, your prior your profession by trade is an attorney, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm a constitutional lawyer. I worked most recently at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and before that I ran a group called the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. But the law that I particularly practiced was in the policy and legislative arena around civil rights and civil liberties. Okay,
awesome. And I'm going to save this kind of towards, well, not the very end, but coming up later. I definitely want to talk to you about right to repair at some point. But there are going to be some questions coming in, and I'd love to be able to address them. Nate, I think you can get an idea about how he can differ from Nancy because, man, I got to tell you, I have nothing against anyone of a particular age. So I don't want anybody to take me wrong. But I just got to say, if I'm 80 years old and I'm worth 150 million something, man, I'm gonna retire and go see the world. Like, what is she still doing in office? Maybe she feels an obligation to serve her constituents, but based on her behavior and the things that you said, never having been debated since the Reagan era, and she's been in the House since like the Lincoln era or something like that.
It was the year that she went into Congress was the last time she debated anyone.
She did what now?
The last time she debated anyone was the year she went into Congress. So 87 was when she started, and that's the last time she's defended her ideas in public.
Okay. You know, I'm sure everyone saw her on TV the other day when she had, I don't know what that was exactly. And again, I don't want to be too critical of anyone, but the good morning, Sunday morning in the middle of a conversation just made me, you know, legitimately concerned about the state of her mental health. And more recently, I've been told, supposedly the pharmacy that delivers drugs to the House of Representatives has been including some Alzheimer's medication. We don't know for who, obviously. They're never going to be able to disclose that. But that's deeply concerning for me, particularly because of the velocity that technology moves at. I mean, we learned from the hearings with the guys from Google and Facebook and Twitter that we have a lot of people who are really kind of out of touch with the way that things work. And it's not, again, this is not a slant against them. It's just that if you didn't grow up with this stuff and you're not able to easily adapt to it, I believe that it's difficult for them to understand how the laws that we have on the books and the laws that are being considered directly relate to the way that technology works. I mean, it's very concerning when it comes to things like privacy and when it comes to things like advertising and censorship and that kind of stuff. We're on a whole different level that a lot of people who don't understand how Facebook works are going to have a hard time really grasping, what's at risk here when it comes to that kind of stuff. And I'd like to get back to that in a second, but I do want to see if we can answer this real quick. I have a regular viewer, and we actually collaborate occasionally as well. Nate, he's from Idaho, and he was saying he wants to ask about your opinion on the Federal Reserve.
There's a whole bunch of ways in which our government is set up to basically fleece the public and transfer wealth up to the 1%. The construction of the Federal Reserve is a piece of that. I'm guessing that maybe Nate has read a few things from our colleagues on the libertarian side of the fence. There's an analogous sort of view from the progressive radical left, monetary theory, which recognizes similarly the way in which our banking system is constructed. From the view of modern monetary theorists, allows us basically to spend into the deficit to do things like make sure everybody can get to a doctor if you get sick, make sure that we can lean into climate resiliency projects if we see entire states on fire while others are getting inundated by multiple hurricanes at once. We have flexibility in monetary policy that you would never know watching the Federal Reserve, because historically we haven't, frankly, governed for, of, and by the people. This is where the parties have worked together. What they've governed for, of, and by are corporations. And that has been the unifying factor between Nancy Pelosi and the corporate wing of the Democratic Party and the institutional Republicans who, again, share the same agenda of enriching and empowering the 1%, of finding new ways to marginalize the future in the service of enriching their donors and making it harder and harder for working people to get by. There was a piece you were raising before about technology and the challenges for folks who have been long serving to stay on the cutting edge. And I want to make this clear. You said this point at the outset, and I agree. I have no beef or no complaints against anybody of a certain age. I would just say that we need healthy transition in legislative bodies to ensure that they remain responsive to the electorate. Now, there have been lots of different places where I've had the opportunity to fight for unpopular ideas before they became popular. Marriage equality is a good example. I'm a cis, hetero, Muslim lawyer raised in the Midwest. I was fighting in courts for the rights of my gay neighbors to marry a partner of their choice in 2004. My client, Jason West, in New Paltz, New York, was the second mayor in the country, the only one ever criminally prosecuted for standing for gay rights. And I was fighting for gay rights in the courts 10 years before Nancy Pelosi accepted a federal right to marry. And it's the difference between voices that stand with our communities enough to take unpopular, challenging fights versus careerists who put their careers first and calculate based on their sense of the political winds what it's safe for them to embrace. As a Muslim immigrant, I haven't been safe in this country, and the things I've fought for haven't been safe. I've fought unpopular fights against the Bush administration on civil liberties. I fought very unpopular fights against the Obama administration on civil liberties. I'll tell a quick story there. There's a judge on the First Circuit Court of Appeals, David Barron. When he served in the Obama administration, he wrote the memo saying that it was okay for the U.S. government to robotically and remotely assassinate U.S. citizens and their kids based on their speech. That was the memo that said it was okay for the drone strike programs targeting.
And Obama actually bragged about that publicly.
And this is how we can say that it's not so different. I mean, if it were true that Republicans were the human rights abusers and Democrats were the guardians of we the people, it would be really easy. But in fact, it's not like that, because both parties are up to their necks in human rights abuses. It was Pelosi who funded the concentration camps at the border where we're using eugenics tactics straight out of the Nazi playbook. That's not a partisan issue. And the issues at stake aren't partisan either. I'm an immigrant. I'm very proud of all of the values that brought all of our forebears here, the ones who were forcibly dragged here, the ones who were subjected to a genocide here, and the ones who came here seeking liberty and opportunity. I think about the inscription in the Statue of Liberty, the poem, the New Colossus, and it talks about, bring me your tired, your poor, your hungry masses yearning to breathe free. And right now, those hungry masses yearning to breathe free, fleeing a climate crisis and a drought across Central America, are being detained en masse in violation of international human rights that our nation once proudly fought a world war to establish. And as an immigrant, I care about these issues very much. I see our own national promises to ourselves and the world being betrayed, not by one political party, by an entire political class. And that's why I'm running to try to replace the head of one very powerful wing of it, because I see the future and all of the prices that it's going to pay if we're not able in the present to carve a different path. We need change desperately. And I think about, I don't have kids of my own, thankfully. I have 9 nephews and nieces, and I have any number of friends who have children. And I think about their generation a lot. And I want to make sure that they have a future that they can look forward to. And I see today, there's a statistic, I can't remember the publication that put this out there, but there was a report about 3 weeks ago that among young people, millennials and Zoomers, the rates of suicide ideation are astronomical, higher than they've ever been. Something like 1 in 4 young people under the age of 30 has seriously considered taking their life in the last 6 months. I can't think of a more glaring symbol, other than the skies being red at high noon, possibly, of just institutional failure. And we can't take it anymore. And as bad as it is now, I think people recognize this is a pretty rough year. It's not going to get any better. The climate crisis is only going to get worse. The pandemic might eventually turn when we find a vaccine, but the misery, resource wars, mass migration, it's only going to get worse. We are now paying the price for generations of unwillingness to heed predictions of preventable problems, and to make better choices. And we need to make better choices. We can make better choices. I think they're going to start in San Francisco with sending a new voice to Washington, and I'm eager to be that voice in the next session of Congress.
Yeah, that's pretty heavy stuff. And, it's bitter irony here, that, and I heard that statistic about the 1 in 4, I think it's people of the age, people age, is it teenagers that have considered suicide in the last 6 months?
I think it included
under
20, 30. But I might be wrong about that. There might have been multiple studies too, for all I know.
There was also a study that came out recently that said, with everything that's going on, as you mentioned, the starving, huddling masses, a few weeks ago, they did a survey and they said something like 25%, basically a quarter of the population didn't feel that they got enough food to eat because of, all the different stuff that's going on right now. There's just, the job losses, and the prices are going up at the grocery store, and the forest is on fire, and people are displaced. And it's not the stereotypical homeless person that, anyone who's not familiar with would say, oh, this is someone on drugs with mental health issues. No, these are families now that are literally not having places to live anymore. And, the idea that you can blame people for being in the situation that they're in, that just kind of illustrates that is not, definitely across the board, not going to work. You can't just dismiss that as you're being lazy. Things are changing. And at this point, I can't see how anyone would not want to get behind helping out your fellow American rather than turning against someone that has a different political ideology than you do. It's crazy.
Let's talk about that with healthcare specifically, if we can, like that. When you talk about helping your fellow American, and this will give us a lens to reflect on your point too about, how people might perceive folks who are unhoused and homeless in particular. I appreciate your point that it is getting worse, and there are, there's a wave of eviction sweeping the country, particularly because in the wake of the pandemic, Congress prioritized tax breaks for millionaires before rent and mortgage relief. Congress already passed a reform that allowed people, about 43,000 people who claim over $1 million a year in income, tax breaks averaging $1.6 million each. That happened this spring, and no one in Congress has seriously considered rent or mortgage relief to prevent the wave of evictions that have been sweeping the country. So you're absolutely right that it's getting worse. I want to push back though in one place, because you were talking about stereotypical constructions of, people who some folks might blame for bad choices, but I want to be really clear about this. The leading cause of homelessness in the United States, long before the pandemic, has always been medical bankruptcy. The people in San Francisco who we step over in the street, they're not people who made bad choices. They're people who got sick and ran out of money. That's what homelessness is. Homelessness is what happens to people when they get sick and run out of money. That's our national health care policy. And that's absolutely appalling. It is a travesty. This is the richest civilization in the history of humankind, there are more empty houses than there are homeless people. And this is how we choose to show up for each other. And just to apply this to healthcare, it was brutal and it was vicious before the pandemic to let cost be a barrier to care, to say that if you don't have money for medicine or you don't have money for the surgery, you don't get it. We have long recognized a human right to emergency care, which means that people who can't pay for their care, when they need emergency care, we end up footing the bill for. It's absolutely senseless. And we could drive down the costs overall. We could improve the outcomes overall. We could help millions of people, particularly people who are sick and need to sleep at night. We could help them sleep at night instead of worrying how they're going to pay for their medicine. I had a conversation with somebody here on the street. I was doing some voter outreach over the last couple hours, and I had this conversation with a young man, particularly about how diabetics are more or less coerced into working for whatever employer will give them health insurance. Mm-hmm. It's incredibly coercive in a system that predicates access to life-saving medical care on your employment. And it limits labor mobility, because if you need life-saving medicine, you don't have the same opportunity to just say no to the market offered alternative. And people don't think about that. Like, people subject to chronic conditions who need medication, it becomes a locus of labor coercion. It's so gross. And then we talked about how people end up in the street, right? Because we don't allow the sane thing that every other country in the industrialized world does, which is recognize that healthcare is a human right, invest collectively in ensuring that everybody gets the medicine they need, and is not only the more humane approach as opposed to the brutal and vicious approach that we've long had here, but during a pandemic, it's the difference between shooting ourselves in the feet by ensuring that our neighbors can't get access to the care that they need versus taking care of our communities and doing this sensible thing. You look at the coronavirus infection and fatality rates, it's so much worse in the United States than it is anywhere else in the country. Why might that be? What's the other outlier with respect to our healthcare policy? The fact that we let cost be a barrier to care. It's not rocket science. I mean, finding a vaccine is that complicated, but the policy's not. It's pretty straightforward. We either care for each other or we kick each other off cliffs. And the generation of corporate policymakers who preceded us have chosen the vicious, senseless, idiotic approach. I would like us to make better decisions. And we can make better decisions when we put some new voices in the seats in Congress, where we've long had, again, corporate Democrats and Republicans working together against us.
Right. And I do want to dig into that a little bit more in a second. But just to set the record straight, I wasn't implying a number of homeless people who have brought things upon themselves. I do realize that medical bankruptcy and some sort of healthcare in one way or another tends to be related to these situations. If it's not a medical bankruptcy, other mental health issues, which I think still fall into the medical category, where, I think back in the Reagan era, when we started cutting back on mental health services and saying, well, we can't take care of you, so go figure it out. And these
critical point you raised there, you're absolutely right. The Reagan era deinstitutionalization created a lot of this problem.
Yeah, I mean, the people that will often, if you have a conversation, I was addressing the perception, not the reality. Yep. You know, there's a lot of people who will say, oh, look at this guy living in the gutter, you must like being there, because there's a psychological phenomena that makes it much easier to walk by and say, well, I guess he likes it, than to actually do something about it. So I absolutely agree with you on that.
But for the grace of whatever one might deem holy or sacred, go any of us. Like, it's, we are all a hair's breadth away.
Yeah, true. Especially as we continue to inflate medical insurance. And as you said, tie it to employment for many people. That is insane that you would have to stay in a miserable job at ridiculously low pay where you can hardly afford to eat in order to, like you said, to survive in many cases. It's crazy. And I think that ultimately, we reach a point where people have to realize that an unhealthy nation is not a prosperous nation. There's no way that can continue. You can't just let people be sick and eventually end up incurring much higher costs, because, as you said, we allow people to go to the emergency room when they need it, whether or not. Whereas had they had some coverage in the first place and they could have got some preventative health care, they probably wouldn't have in many cases wouldn't have ended up in that situation. So it's a bigger burden on people who are constantly complaining about why they have to pay so much for healthcare. So it's just such a vicious circle. And
Right.
yet the idea that, well, I want to take care of me and everybody else can figure it out. Well, if we have things like health insurance companies, that's going to be a constant. You're always going to have to worry about everyone else inside the pool. But in any case, I know that we're running short on time, so I don't want to. These things can go on as long as you'll let them. So I won't. I'll stop myself before we get there. One of the things that I did want to definitely talk about while we're here, and hopefully you're pretty familiar with it already, and this is crucial, especially for my channel. And this is going to be, I think, a snippet where I really want people to get to hear what you have to say about it. We have been fighting this battle for a long time, and again, up against the corporation. So, as usual, it's David versus Goliath, where we have lots of big tech companies who would really rather that people like me do not earn a living the way that I do. Because if I can make this device right here, and only I can fix it, and nobody else can, and particularly when it comes to telecommunications, something that I think that most people would agree that you really can't live without nowadays. There are very few exceptions. I mean, there might be a few people among us who would say, yeah, I don't need my cell phone for a week, no problem. But I don't think I could count that number that I know on one hand. This is practically a utility at this point. So what we do here, and a lot of other people on YouTube, YouTube and other places, we have taken part in a multi-billion-dollar industry where we fix these devices when they have a problem, so that you don't have to go make an appointment at Apple. You don't have to mail your phone to Samsung and wait for 2 weeks for it to come back with all of your information wiped off of it, and any accessories that you sent in are gone. We've carved out this niche the way that many other industries have throughout history. Great example probably would be the auto repair industry. We had the Moss-Magnuson Act that was passed because people in Congress agreed it's ridiculous that if you own a Chevrolet, that you would have to go to a Chevrolet mechanic to repair it. It's insanity, right? And a lot of us don't live right next to an Apple store. A lot of people live in a tech desert where they're lucky to have cell phone reception. So when that thing goes down, if there's a guy down the street that can fix it, that makes things work. Everybody's happy. The customer is happy. We're happy. The phone carrier gets to keep their customer. But it's as if these big companies want to fight us tooth and nail to prevent us from having access to the replacement parts and the information that we need to make them work. I think a lot of my viewers would ask you, where do you stand on this? And when you're elected, how are we going to pursue this and continue to make the world a better place for people who use technology, which is really all of us, right?
I'm very dedicated, among other things, to the right to repair and to ensuring that we treat technology as a liberatory arena, one that we can democratize, rather than one that becomes predatory. Now, to be fair, in terms of my work and where I've most deeply focused over the last 10 years, surveillance has been the greater threat to digital rights and liberties, that on one of which I've been more focused. But just to embrace your question around the right to repair and digital restrictions management, I see DRM as restrictions on the rights of users, and I see opportunities to advance the right to repair as democratizing control over technology. Now, I want to complicate this because one of the corporate antagonists to the right to repair has been Apple. In the surveillance and privacy arena, that happens to be a company that has been rarely among tech companies in a better position than most. In 2016, I had the opportunity to fight the FBI because it was going after trying to get Apple to hack its devices on behalf of the government to expose the information of its users. And the company in the privacy arena made good choices, while in the right to repair and DRM arena, it's been, frankly, one of the worst corporate actors in terms of suppressing movements in the states to adopt bills that would, for instance, allow people the right to do-it-yourself repairs, the opportunity to disseminate repair guides, to open source basically aftermarket repair markets that should be, now this is a whole other layer here, that should be illegal under existing antitrust laws. There's no reason that original equipment manufacturers should have exclusive rights to aftermarket repair services. that's actually a violation of long established antitrust principles that have fallen out of favor. One of my last articles when I was at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, I had a chance to write with one of my colleagues there, Mitch Stoltz, a piece particularly addressing the essential facilities doctrine in antitrust. This is worth a minute to dig into. So antitrust balances a lot of different values. It particularly aims to advance both fairness and efficiency by guarding the market from co-optation by dominant actors and collusion among actors that harm consumers in the service of filling their own pockets. Now, the essential facilities doctrine advances antitrust more or less to the zenith, like the sort of most aggressive, redistributive, fairness promoting vision it's ever achieved in our law, in our jurisprudence. And it's been out of favor for about a generation. It's the same doctrine that was used to split up AT&T, specifically thinking about telecommunications, to your point. It's the same doctrine that was used to break up monopolies over bridge access. In the era of the railroad, some railroad companies tried to exclusively claim that they had exclusive control and access to the bridges that they owned. And the court said, hell no, if you own a bridge and it's an essential facility to competition, you have to share that. That's kind of the same, again, the principle behind the AT&T breakup. Essential facilities can't be controlled by dominant actors. Now, when you look online, we frankly have, there's any number of places where if we applied the essential facilities doctrine, which the courts, because they've been taken over by the right wing, have been disinclined to do since the 70s, existing law offers plenty of ways to dismantle these litany of ways in which corporations undermine competition, particularly by restraining access to repair services and ensuring that, for instance, people who tinker with their devices in many cases have been subject to very vicious kinds of penalties. And just to be clear, when we talk about devices, especially medical devices, we're talking sometimes about issues that implicate not just control over technology, but control over ourselves. You know, if you're somebody who is, let's say, sensorily impaired and you rely on technology to augment your senses and you don't have control over the technology that allows you to sense the world around you, it's incredibly coercive to force people to comply with whatever arbitrary corporate decision happens. I see this getting especially pernicious when you think about deplatforming decisions, when you have companies that offline products and just decide they're not going to support a product line anymore. Well, what about when that product line is your pacemaker? It would be really nice to have an individual right, a device owner right to access firmware and software, and a right to, you know, ideally, you know, I can see the risks involved in some cases here, right? And so that's one reason why we need to have like safety precautions. Ideally, this would be one place where there might be liability protections for people. You know, like if repair guides are out there, making sure that they're like vetted and researched before, you know, allowing people to disseminate them. I think there's an important thing here about guarding the consumer interest to accurate information. But that notwithstanding, it certainly doesn't make sense to condition that all on the corporate profit interest. That's yet another example, and there are any number in our law, where we structurally privilege and frankly encourage and invite corruption. And I think when you talk about the fact that device owners can't control their own devices, I see the medical device context as where it gets, you know, most morally and ethically problematic. And this is the law as we've accepted it. You know, we've let intellectual property eat consumer rights. And that's one among many examples where I could, you know, chase a rabbit. But just, again, themes to reinforce there. Corporate rights over consumer rights are a problem. Existing antitrust law could be enough under the essential facilities doctrine to deal with this problem if the courts weren't co-opted by the right wing. And I think there are lots of ways we can better regulate markets to ensure that consumers aren't preyed on by corporations, if only by allowing access to aftermarket research, repair services.
Right. And you bring up a good point. And I believe that most of the people in my field would be in total agreement. As you mentioned, with medical devices, we certainly don't want to introduce any liability based on incompetence or otherwise. We don't want to say, hey, everybody, here it is, good luck with it. I believe that you'll find most of the professionals, at least, that do electronics repairs, obviously medicine, farm equipment, all these other industries that are being really kind of exploited because of the lack of right to repair. We want that. We want some sort of certification or some sort of regulation that says that it's not just some hack on the street that, it's a free for all. we want people to feel confident, and obviously, we want things to work properly. We don't want to cause damages, like you said, especially when it comes to medical equipment. I don't think there's any argument on that. In fact, it might help a lot of people who are willing to do good work and eliminate a lot of the ones that give us a bad reputation sometimes. So that's awesome to hear. You stated that
it could be just one piece of, because you're pressing on an important point there around like certification. It could be an opportunity for the companies, right? I mean, many companies have done this. Think about the role that like Microsoft has had with respect to certifying, engineers on its operating system. Apple could run a certification program. They do this with resellers already. They do this with service techs on some of their platforms. There's no reason why they couldn't have certification programs for a more decentralized layer of service repair. This could be a locus of opportunity for companies, but they don't embrace it that way because, frankly, they're trying to maximize their profit, again, at the cost of the public interest.
Yeah, it's kind of funny that you mentioned Apple, because technically, they do have an Apple certification program.
Okay.
But it's it's basically a paid for right that you can get through after jumping through many hoops, that pretty much says that you can buy OEM screens from Apple at a cost that is prohibitive for you to compete with the service that they offer in their store. So, and you're allowed to replace screens and batteries, and everything else is just, go to Apple and get a new phone. So at a certain point they do. And I believe that they hide behind that, as well as, the proprietary information they say it is that they don't want to turn over to anyone. And I believe that that's why they've been able to, that and having an unlimited bankroll, of course, they've been able to kind of argue against that for a long time. But thank you for the input on that. That's definitely something we wanted to hear. You did mention that one of the things that you're highly involved in is going, or have been and will be, has to do with privacy. And I'm interested to hear about that as well, if you'd like to go into that a bit.
Thank you. One reason I'm concerned about privacy is that it is a necessary component for democracy. People think about privacy as the private right sometimes, for instance, in not being seen or your activity not being transparent to the public. That's a private interest. There is also a public interest in privacy. And this is an important one to remember at a time like this, when we have an aspiring fascist tyrant, trying to subvert our democracy. The right to privacy is the right to autonomy. It's the right to speech for vulnerable people, without which we can't have a democracy. When vulnerable people can't speak, we lose democracy. That's why we have First Amendment protections for anonymous speech. Now, it's also why surveillance threatens not just individual rights, and not just the rights of any community, and not just abstract principles in the First and the Fourth and the 14th Amendments. Surveillance threatens democracy, particularly because at every era in our history, long preceding this one, whenever we've had domestic surveillance programs, they have always, every time, been politicized, used not to suppress legitimate security threats, but to suppress political speech. There was a 50-year period from the 50s. Frankly, it never ended. People say it ended in the 70s. It didn't really. It certainly continued into the 80s, and then kicked back off again in the 90s, and it's certainly been true since the 2000s. Domestic surveillance has been used in our nation's past, documented FBI records, to neutralize domestic social movements, from the movement to bring peace in the face of the war in Vietnam, movements for equal rights for women, movements for Puerto Rican independence, Native American rights, movements for civil rights, Black power, you name it. White supremacists even. I mean, it's an equal opportunity thing. You might just take away from it the idea that if you believe anything in the United States, despite our commitment to the First Amendment and freedom of conscience and speech and assembly, despite that theoretical right, our government has always suppressed dissent, and particularly by monitoring it. And in the case of the COINTELPRO era, neutralizing it. They did much more than just surveillance, but surveillance was part of a broader project of neutralizing domestic social groups. And it could be again, and that's the point. It's why we have constitutional protections to prevent these kind of programs from being hatched. Now, a lot of people remember the Edward Snowden revelations of 2013. I started focusing on these issues professionally about 5 years before that. So by the time Snowden came forward, I'd been leading for By that point, it would have been 3 years. The Bill of Rights Defense Committee was an organization founded when I was still in law school. I did not found it. I was at Stanford in the early 2000s, and BORDC, the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, was founded in Massachusetts at the time. And the board hired me in year 8 to carry the organization forward. And so I'd been leading this National Civil Liberties Organization dedicated to fighting the Patriot Act when Edward Snowden came forward. It was about a year after his revelations, about a year and a half. I was arrested in the US Senate for asking a question. I was not trying to get arrested. I was trying to write an article. And I was asking Obama's Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, I asked him how he justified never facing a charge for perjury, even though he'd lied to the Senate under oath about mass surveillance, when around the same time, about 6 months before I asked this question, and about maybe a year after Clapper had made this representation, Eric Garner in New York City was killed in the street without charge, without trial, for a trivial offense that didn't have a victim. So just to be clear here, we have powerless people killed, arbitrary, lethal, so-called justice, no charge, no trial, no anything, on the suspicion of committing trivial acts. When you have powerful people committing grave acts of, on the public record, offending the entire republic and frankly the world, and not only never facing a charge for it, but getting rewarded for it with pensions, prestige. I mean, this person, James Clapper, is a repeat guest on MSNBC to this day. And, you know, and that's what we call equal justice under the law. Like, how do you answer that? And I walked out of the room in handcuffs just for asking the question. And, you know,
what did they charge you with? I mean, were you arrested? Was there a formal charge, or?
There was, though. They dropped the charges before I came. I mean, no one was going to stand by this charge, but it was obstructing.
Okay, so it was just to get you to stop talking, basically.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they charged me with obstructing someone who I was standing 50 feet behind while he was walking in the other direction.
Okay.
So, like, yeah, you tell me how legitimate that.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of leeway as to exercising certain types of enforcement, but I don't want to really go down that road right now, especially in light of what's in any case, because that's just going to be a whole nother stream at some point. I
want end on the privacy thing just to finish this. So what I particularly did when I was at BORDC was engineer privacy protections at the local level against police departments and organize grassroots coalitions to politicize those reforms in city councils and in state legislatures around the countries and around the country. And we won different pieces of a model bill that I wrote in 2010 called the Local Civil Rights Restoration Act. We won pieces of it around the country. Providence, Rhode Island is the sort of high watermark in terms of reflecting that vision. Many parts of that vision that I wrote ended up in the Community Police Relations Act, adopted in Providence in the summer of 2017. And so this work of working with local governments to protect privacy, not just against three-letter agencies in Washington, but against the Mayberry Police Department. It's a whole vector of surveillance that people take their eye off the ball of. And I recognize how surveillance emerges from lots of different vectors. And I've done a lot of work in a lot of different ways to try to defend it.
Yeah.
Well, there was some defend privacy in the face of it, I should say. Sorry, it's been too long.
That's okay. My camera's lagging, and I can't tell when you're talking to what occasionally. Just real quick, it's interesting. When I think about surveillance and privacy, personally, I'm very concerned about the control that corporations have over everything that's being collected, for a number of reasons. And this could become a very complicated conversation as well. But the fact that we know that any three-letter agency can go to Facebook, for example, and say, hey, we need to see all of Shahid's pictures, posts, replies, likes, etc., blah, blah, blah. And people may say, well, who cares about that? But we have to remember that the reach of the internet is not limited to the government of the United States. Anyone in the world, any official from any government that says, hey, Facebook, Google, whoever it is, we need to know everything about this person, that should concern all of us, I think, a little bit, and what the thing that Edwards that really stuck with me, and I like it because it kind of summarizes everything from one of the later Snowden interviews, is that people will often say that, well, if you don't have anything to hide, you don't have anything to worry about. And his response is, well, if you don't have anything to say, would you go ahead and give up your right to free speech? And
Well,
to
the way
me,
he put it
that
precisely just was a little sharper that he said, if you have nothing to hide, you probably have nothing to say. That
okay,
and that's a really poignant way of connecting privacy to dissent, because if you feel
right,
like you don't care what they look at, you might not be a dissident. You might not be somebody who needs privacy in the way that a gay person in Alabama or a Trump supporter in Midtown Manhattan, or maybe the Upper East Side. I don't know, like where exactly in Manhattan a Trump supporter might be most unpopular. But the point is, if you're unpopular where you're at, you lose your speech rights if you don't have privacy. And privacy
right.
stands in for the freedom of expression for people who are vulnerable. And if you don't care about privacy, it might be because you're either not vulnerable or you're not outspoken. But there are people who need to be outspoken who are vulnerable, and that's who we need to recognize is implicated in all this.
Right. And one of these days you might have something to say. So it's probably a good idea that we preserve that right. All of the above.
Well said.
Okay. I'm going to let you go here real quick. I'm going to attempt to answer a question for you from the chat. And then you can correct me if I'm wrong. Okay. And it'll give an indication as to what I know about your policy. Hopefully. Got my fingers crossed here. So again, Nate asked if you support the Second Amendment. And I'm going to say that you are not in favor of assault weapons, people having weapons of war in their possession. But I suspect that means that you are not necessarily opposed to the Second Amendment right to bear arms. Is that somewhat close?
Yeah, you're definitely on it. I do favor restrictions on assault style weapons. I think that the right to bear arms doesn't entail the right to bear military arms. Now, my take on the Second Amendment is somewhat novel, and you actually, it was a good take. I wrote an article about this in the wake of the Ferguson uprising. And it goes like this. People think about the Second Amendment through the lens of what it was meant to be at the time of the founding. At the time of the founding, the Second Amendment is the escape hatch. If the First Amendment, it's been described by a professor at NYU, Bert Newborn, as Madison's music. The First Amendment is 5 different rights that together, different notes that comprise a symphony of political participation. It's the right to believe what you want, the right to print what you want, the right to assemble people together, the right to petition the government in support of your shared concerns. The Second Amendment is what happens if all else fails. The Second Amendment is the right to resistance if the government becomes tyrannical. It makes sense in the context of the Third. The Third Amendment is the right to not let government station troops in your house. And the Fourth Amendment is the right not to be subjected to searches and seizures. So the Second Amendment here has a crucial role in the constitutional design. Here's the problem. It also has a hole in the bucket. The hole in the bucket of the Second Amendment is the paramilitarization of police. Now, I'm going to thread a historical arc here first before I finish the constitutional loop. Why do we have paramilitary police in the United States? People forget there is a history here. The reason we have paramilitary police in the United States is because in the 1990s, this is not a conspiracy theory, this is documented fact, the Central Intelligence Agency was running drugs into U.S. cities. And narco traffickers trained, funded, and equipped by the CIA were killing U.S. police officers, particularly in Miami and Los Angeles. There was a movement to better arm police officers in the face of narco traffickers. People at the time didn't realize that it was the CIA sending the narco traffickers. But what we ended up doing, instead of holding anyone at the CIA accountable, was militarizing police across the United States. That's why we have paramilitary police. Now, what does the militarization of police mean for the relationship between a right to bear arms and a right to effective resistance against a tyrannical government? Once you have paramilitary police, a right to bear arms, the textual right in the Constitution, becomes disentangled, entirely unrelated to its purpose. Its purpose was a right to resistance, but the right to bear arms is how they guarded it. But once you have paramilitary police, the right to bear arms doesn't equate resistance. It's just the right to get shot by a SWAT team. But here's the point. I want to finish this, and I think your community might like this. I would like to, and this isn't the kind of thing we can legislate, and I don't even frankly know how to make this established in the law. It would have to come about through jurisprudence and the kind of thing we develop in a discourse. But I would like to see a Second Amendment right emerge to data exfiltration from government agencies. A right to resistance in the digital age is a right to hacking, particularly hacking the government. one thing I want to go back to a previous point that you made about government access to and foreign government access to all the information online in the hands of corporations. It's not just governments either. Every Google search you've ever made in your life, well, at least since the time you might have gotten married going forward, is discoverable in a divorce proceeding. Chew on that. It can be a terrifying thing for people to think about, but that's the facts. It's not just governments. I mean, the threat to privacy are potential future employers, your kids, your neighbors. You know, it's a wild west with respect to digital privacy. And it's one reason why I want to make sure that people have control over their data.
Yeah, it's a crazy thing. I mean, there's so many possibilities. And I think one of the ones that someone gave me one time was, you know, if you go to a hardware store and you buy duct tape and rope and you put it on your credit card, and then a murder takes place a few blocks from your house, you know, all this stuff is collated at some point. And I know that's a stretch, but this kind of things happen. You know, people walk by somebody was riding on a bicycle past a crime scene. Their phone it pings the wireless network, and suddenly that person is a suspect because they were in that vicinity. And you just start thinking about all the implications of basically, you know, looking at everything under a microscope. It's crazy. And not only that, but the amount of resources that must be expended and not end up with really getting anywhere, because we take a lot of leaps, you know, and try to connect things that we want to make happen, especially in pursuit of some sort of criminal case or whatever it is that might be happening, or to, like you said, to silence dissent, you know, to find anything that you can use to keep the person who doesn't agree with you from making any noise or speaking. It's crazy times to live in, but I'm really excited that this is something high on your list, and I hope that we continue to see more candidates running for office. I wish I was in your district. I really do. I told Anthony, I wish you'd move back to San Francisco long enough to vote, man, and get out there. And oh man, but we're going to do everything we can to raise some awareness. And Nate, I'm going to get back to you. I need to let Shahid go because he's been here way longer than you planned, had a long night, but we'll keep in touch, man.
If I can, Mike, if I may, just to, you know, anybody who's eager to learn more about our campaign, anyone, anywhere can help us out by phone banking or text banking. We'd invite you to explore our campaign at shahidforchange.us. That's shahidforchange.us. We're also on all the social media platforms, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, at Shahid for Change.
And I will add that link to the video description, which I'm not sure if I did yet, but we'll definitely do that. Do you have any upcoming appearances that are on in the near future that we can hear you speak at again?
Yeah, well, so because the pandemic's in place, we're not doing indoor events, but we're doing socially distanced outdoor voter outreach events all over the city. I was at Dolores Park this evening, and then in the Castro. We'll be all over San Francisco at a park near you, and also online. In fact, there'll be a restream, I think, next weekend of a climate justice panel that I just did last week with a climate scientist out of Los Angeles and an indigenous leader who was one of the first people setting up teepees at Standing Rock. And we talked about the climate justice issues during the week of the UN Climate Week. And that'll be restreamed. I think the date of the restream is this upcoming Saturday.
Okay, awesome. And I'm sure that'll be announced on your website as well.
Yeah, certainly on our social media platforms. Twitter's where we do the most frequent updates, and you'll see it on Facebook if not there.
Okay, cool. Did we skip anything that you specifically wanted to speak about? Because I'm certainly not trying to cut you off. I just feel like, I don't want you to be obligated.
You're kind. I'm just, grateful to be the first Democrat in 30 years to challenge Nancy Pelosi. I think it's bizarre that she hasn't debated anyone since 1987. I think San Francisco deserves better than that. I think our nation needs more voices in the squad to secure a Green New Deal, to make sure that cost isn't a barrier to care, to make sure that there's a future to which young people can look forward and be excited about. I'm eager to be part of that voice defending the future from the predation of our failed corporate past. And I'm grateful for the chance to connect with your audience tonight, Mike. Thanks again for having me.
Man, thank you. And I'm glad that I believe your campaign is more strategic than most people realize. If we can unseat Pelosi, I believe that a lot of change will be coming. So that's awesome that you're in San Francisco, and so is she.
Right on. Have a good night.
All
I
right.
hope to see you again
Hey,
soon.
you
My
too.
best to Anthony.
Oh, for sure. Will do, man. All right.
Right
Take
on.
it easy, and look forward to talking to you again.
Thanks, Mike. Send us the link. We'll share it.
All right. Will do.
All right.
Have
bye.
a good one.
You too.
All right, everyone. Yeah, I'm out of here. That was Shahid Buttar. I will put his link in the video description. Nate, I know you and probably other people had a lot of questions, but I really put this guy over time. So I'll definitely reach out to him later on if there are other things that you're interested in knowing, specifically your questions. He happens to be a colleague of my brother's, so it's not like he's completely out of reach, which is another thing that I like. You know, if there are people who are going to represent us, it's nice when we can actually communicate with them that way. So I'll be certain to follow up with them on the rest of your questions. Again, thanks everyone for joining me, and I will see you next time.